and welcome to the UNNF video podcast. We have a roundup of topics for you today, including an homage to the guy who's changed this world for better or worse, Robert Delisle. Okay, to start, I want to explain a little bit about this topic for the benefit of those who have been firmly living under a rock for the past 6 years, unlikely as that sounds. This muse took the world by storm and challenged the very concept of how we view the world. For it was June 2022 when this young man revealed that angels certainly do exist. A momentous day indeed. Every news channel in the world gave report of Robert's first coming out ceremony. Every social media platform was talking about it for weeks as people were sharing photos and videos online. What can I say? One moment Robert was doing fashion shows, parading up and down the catwalk. The next, he's revealing these huge black feathered wings that splay out from his back like he's some kind of angel messenger from the Lord. When you review the footage from 6 years ago, it still grabs you. Incredible! Here in the studio with me now is Dr. Magnus Jacobs, PhD, and classic historian. He has written an article on this phenomenon titled Myths and Mankind. Doctor, what are your impressions of Robert, and what makes a muse, a creature of myth, just one day decide to announce to the modern world, hey look, I'm here?
Well, John, it's like this. Robert, as far as I am aware, was not born a muse. In fact, he was human like you and I. Came from an ordinary background. In point of fact, he came out and told me everything in our last interview. He was feeling lost, alone, and desperately in need to announce himself to the world. Problem is, were we ready? Was man quite ready to learn that these creatures of myth live by our sides and have actually been living with us here since the classic era? Many of us embraced it. For some it offers hope. Others will judge the coming of the angel Christ in our midst as a threat to everything they believe. These symbols and paradigms belong in the past. Throwbacks to a different pagan time when druids knelt before ancient deities and poets wrote epic tales of the heroes of old. You can't expect all these modern religions that have embedded themselves in progressive doctrines to just suddenly throw it all out the window just because some winged rebel comes along to cast doubt on everything. Now, I have nothing against Robert. He is a fine young man, but he has to realize one thing, that the human race is very much fractured in its opinion right now. Our view of the world, by and large, will never be the same again. In all of this, we hear leftist legislators talking about how this will alter the very model of society and argue that it is changing at this very moment. They talk of reforms. This is too dangerous, as the very models and paradigms we see here are changing before our very eyes.
Who does that man think he is? Robert asked, sounding a little put out. Sure, he thinks I'm some sort of rebel rouser. The artist stopped what he was doing. He craned his neck around the large canvas in order to address the object of study, sitting in front of him. I'm sure he merely stated the facts as he sees them, he told Robert. You have to admit your little stunt 6 years ago actually did cause a few giant ripples. I mean, you went up on that big old catwalk and there, right in front of all those sponsors, you declared, "Here I am, Robert, the Muse. Oh yeah, Greek myths actually do exist. That's not something people forget in a big hurry. Now you're worried about one PhD going up and calling you a rebel? Really? I wouldn't mind so much," Robert retorted. "But contrary to popular belief, I didn't do it for the ratings." No, of course not, the artist countered. You did it because you were bored and lonely. I know you, Robert. You relish the idea of watching the whole world burn around you. Oh, for the love of God, Robert, will you stop pacing and sit down? I can't very well paint you when you're moving around like a bloody peacock. Robert picked up a handful of grapes from the table and, petulantly, he resumed his perch on the daybed. His eyes wandered to observe the full and impressive panorama. The penthouse apartment commanded a full view of the New York skyline and all its modern majesty. I don't get why people are against me, Robert stated. Think about what I've done to enhance our lives. We live in a society now that is far less inclined to listen to the privileged few. What does that actually mean, Robert? The artist asked, feeling like he was losing his patience. If by less inclined you mean we've all been tipped to the far left, you couldn't be more wrong. In fact, the free world couldn't be more fractured than it is present. Oh, and you can add that to the litany of mistakes you have made. The artist applied a rather violent brushstroke to the canvas. "What mistakes?" Robert snapped. "I haven't done anything wrong. The problem is people refuse to actually question anything. Question a flag and people will assume you're an anarchist. Call into question a way of life and all of a sudden people will call you a fool. Why? Because it's just too much trouble to confront real issues, isn't it? It encourages argument. It brings contention to people's otherwise perfect little lives. God help you if you ever question that. Look, am I the only one who desired fairness, honesty, and a better quality of life for everyone? Is that wrong?" "Maybe," answered his artist friend. "And maybe thinking yourself to be right all the time is where you are wrong. Bottom line, you declare that you are right and everyone else is wrong. And what's more, you negate people's rights to choose. You negate the democratic rights of the people." "No," Robert retaliated. "How can you possibly say that what we had before was freedom of any kind? Choice. Choice manipulated and freedoms tailored were but a shadow of the true democracy that I gave them. Just think back to what things used to be like before I took action. Look what I've done for the community of muses. Look what I've done for art. Revealing my wings to the world was the start of a bold movement." "No, bowel movement," the other added out of frivolity. "Oh, very funny. In spite of everything, you still remain cynical. Don't you see? People have been forced to question the very precepts of culture. That's a big step in the right direction, I would say. Imagine the Stonewall riots for a second. Do you think if all those people without so much of a grain of privilege had refused to lift a finger, to riot, and to make their voices heard, any of us would be allowed to enjoy the freedoms we have today? No, of course not. I'm a muse, and I refuse to coast through this precious life without so much as a moment's recognition. I refuse to remain invisible." The artist sat and tried to listen to Robert's side of the argument. "You see," the muse went on, "I'm a firm believer in art. It shouldn't take a genius to see that art should be judged on its merits. People should not accept the medium blindly, is what I'm saying. The old system generated more money and privilege than any single entity had any moral right to. Creation was simply replaced by weak popularization. The whole culture was massively restrictive because all that people were allowed at the end of the day were two choices. A or B. And that isn't a choice. That's compliance." The artist looked back at his canvas as he observed the near-complete fruits of his own labors. "Don't you see?" Robert went on. "Humanity needed its so-called myths. You were all crying out inside for that one individual to come out and show you the way. And this is the real way. Muses and humans living side by side, giving each other what we need, not to survive, but to live." "Yes, and we all should be thankful for you, Robert," the artist said, glibly. "No, you shouldn't be thankful. I'm not holding anything over you. And this quaint idea of placing a few above the many is a sickness that belongs in the past. We're past that now. Or you should have moved past that. Granted, unlike the cultural elites, I don't concoct half-baked arguments to lull your senses, or deluge you with slogans in order to dull your mind. That was the purview of the sociopath. That, my friend, was the moral compass of the dinosaur. Behold, humanity now at its finest." "Okay," the man said as he started packing away his brushes. "I'll come back another time when you're in a better mood." Robert didn't say a word at this point. He felt as though he had been emotionally goaded into making a fool of himself. He experienced embarrassment and then frustration, and afterwards the anger rose in him like a geyser, forcing all the pressure to well up in his throat. But any further impulse to utter a sound was choked by his fears. His senses gave a sudden jolt as he heard the door slam. Robert had been offered an interview on network television. More than anything, he wanted to set the record straight. He desired validation for his argument and for his entire existence, which, he understood, was called into question. In truth, he felt that since his argument had been contested, this had somehow brought to light the undermining doubt in his own worth as an individual. And such a belief could never go unchallenged. Robert was seated in the green room, watching the makeup artist apply the finishing touches. The stage presenter stepped in. "Okay, Robert, you're up in 5. The Muse nodded his reply. Robert stepped out onto the platform, facing the auditorium and the crowds who had gathered there to hear his speech. The moment Robert began to talk, you could have heard a pin drop. The room was silent. "I can tell you exactly how I felt that day," he began to explain. "When I loosened my wings, that day you all saw me for what I truly am. Some of you recoiled. What is he? Some of you must have wondered, is he some sort of devil or harpy? But some of you felt something more. Hope. That I was some kind of angel with a message of blessings. And I tell you, I felt vindicated. I felt that I had beaten the fear finally in my own heart. And that is what we have done, all of us. We have conquered the fear that has choked us for too long." He gave a pause as he weighed the looks of the faces in the crowd. "We exclaimed, 'No more!'" he continued to tell them. "No more hiding in obscurity. We, each and every one of us, has control." He looked down at his notes, then raised his head to view the people, hanging on his every word. "For years the upper class told you what to say, what to think, and with purchase power, cleverly controlled your intake. Well, your children will no longer have to pay the price of their folly. You, my friends, I look at you all. I look at your children, and their children shall know what true freedom is. Freedom from past ideologies. Free from lazy, sloppy, inept principles and self-serving ideologies. You are free. You have a say now. We all have a say. Humanity no longer has to fear anything any longer. We are all artists now, painting a rosier picture for the future. The Renaissance is here at last." A thunderous roar of cheer and claps filled the vast auditorium. It had just turned 1800 hours. Robert left the auditorium accompanied by two of his bodyguards. Abruptly, he stopped as he noticed a familiar face. There was a tall young man leaning against the wall. Both their eyes met, and in that moment, Robert recognized him. "Hey, Rob," the other said. "Long time no see. I see you've made quite a name for yourself." "Hey, Ira. What's up?" Robert replied a little cautiously. "Nothing's up here. Everything's just peachy." "You came here to hear my speech?" Robert asked, trying to make small talk. "Listen, Robert." The other changed the subject. "I know we've had our little disagreements in the past." "Oh, really?" Robert answered with sarcasm. "We've always disagreed. You tried to tell me once that showing my wings to the world would be a bad choice." "Maybe it was," the Muse known as Ira retorted. "You went up on that catwalk and you showed everyone that there was something much more to life than what everyone had expected. You revealed to the world that muses exist. Hell, now even Santa and the Tooth Fairy exists. Then you went and knocked the foundations away from under our very feet. I lost my job. I lost my livelihood. And heaven help me, I lost my anonymity too. Now there's not a day goes by I don't get some curious human child asking me, 'Wow, mister, can I see your wings? Are you a real muse like that guy on the TV?' Listen, if it means anything, I'm sorry, okay? I had my own path to walk. I'm not like you, Ira. I was born into this life an average human being, with average failings and feelings. I guess what I'm trying to say is, the time I was changed into a muse was the best and worst night of my life. I lost friends. I lost family. It also gave me a whole new lease on life. Thing is, I had no idea how to deal with it. Still don't. I'm still human, with human feelings, and trapped in a muse's body. I just couldn't deal with the pressure of everything. That's why I'm here," Ira told him at last. "I just wanted the opportunity to tell you, you were right. Okay?" He extended his hand to Robert. "Friends again?" Robert looked down and considered the hand open before him. Once they had been friends. They had also been rivals, contestants on the catwalk, vying for the admiration and love of the sponsors and their employers. Perhaps 6 years was a long time to bear a grudge. Finally, Robert took his hand. They walked together. 2 of Robert's bodyguards were still in tow.
Well, look at you now. You may still have human feelings, but you certainly did something no human has ever done. United this world in so many good ways. Quite impressive.
Robert was indeed feeling very disarmed by Ira's praises.
To imagine a society so hardwired into believing the lies for decades could be turned around by one individual.
He shook his head in disbelief.
But you did it.
Robert looked up and caught Ira's eyes.
You did that.
He went on to say.
Who could have imagined or dreamed it possible?
Yet, Robert began to confess, I still feel a lot of guilt for what I've done. I've lost a lot of friends over the years. I turned my back on my father, on the very people who mattered to me. I let them think the worst because I was too afraid of what I'd become. I've lost lovers because of what I am. And what am I? That's right. I'm a trickster with the ability to alter my face. Only it's not an ability, it's an involuntary curse. You know, I told you once that my face had a sort of textual filter applied to it, depending on who is looking at me in that precise moment. It's hard to maintain friendships or relationships with people when your whole appearance is in flux.
Well, I still recognize you, Robert. Even after 6 years. That's the same face that I remember,
Ira observed.
Maybe coming out, admitting to the world that you are a Muse was enough to obliterate that curse for good. You ever think of that? Maybe it's been fear all along. The guilt and all that self-doubt that turned your face into a shifting carousel of identities. Maybe you woke up like some sleeping beauty, and this action is what finally lifted the curse.
Robert stopped to give this thought his full attention.
Freedom is not just subjective. Sometimes it has a way of being truly objective.
Robert sat and listened to the sound of the nightlife from his mezzanine floor. The cool summer breeze entered in through sliding French doors, opened to the balcony and commanding a full view of New York's skyline beyond. He mused to himself, contemplating his large victories and even larger defeats, weighing them all together in his deepest, roaming thoughts. The comm system buzzed suddenly. He leaned forward to answer it. Yes? He said.
I'm here,
came the message. I'll let you in, Ira. Just 1 second. A moment or two later, Ira was standing at the door. He smiled as he had some good news to impart.
They want me back. Isn't that good news?
Robert stood up. That's excellent news! When do you start?
When do we start?
He corrected Robert. What? Robert asked, hardly able to believe what he was hearing. No, I'm not going back to that. That's all in the past. I'm done with the catwalk. No, I won't ever go back. Ira drew in a breath.
Listen, you owe me big, Robert. Because of your stunt 6 years ago, I faced the music. They want you back now, but they only allowed me to come back if I agreed to convince you to come with me. Come on, we're a team.
Team? Really? Robert shook his head. You don't get it, Ira. You never did. You're always living in the past. Me, I learned a long time ago to look to the future. I never, ever look back. Ira had his jaw set as he began to clench his hands tightly at his side.
Well, let me just say, he countered quickly, your future is a lie. Didn't want to say it, but you forced my hand. You haven't changed one bit, Robert. Your future is a lie. You see, you want the world to change, but you have no reserve, no plan. You have always been running from something. That is your foundation. Do you even know what you are running from, or are you running towards something? You are incapable of envisioning the full political roadmap upon which your concepts of freedom are based. Hard to see the broadest picture, as it were. Think about your actions for a moment and understand how they impact on others. Just stop thinking about yourself for once, is what I'm saying.
Well, that sounds familiar, said Robert cynically. A far cry from the individual giving me his ulterior speech yesterday. I see now. It was all to get me to lower my guard. Get me to agree to come back to the old prison of belief we both shared once. You haven't changed one iota. Make me feel wrong and guilty just so you can get your way all the time. Well, I'm afraid it's not going to wash. It's your past that is a total lie.
Oh, really?
Ira retorted.
Says the guy who thinks he's better than everyone else.
Thinks he's above everyone. That's you. You describe yourself. You can't get what you want, so you resort to bullying. You resort to shaming me, coercing me. Well, I no longer fear you. Yeah, how does that make you feel, Ira? I no longer fear you. And with that, Ira turned. He left under a cloud, slamming the door behind him. Robert looked at the door through which Ira had exited. Again, this had been a short-lived friendship, just like all the rest. Maybe Ira had been right all along, and maybe Robert had no idea what he was doing. Several days passed. The Muse lay upon the tiled floor with the French doors open, his back propped against the wall, watching the raindrops spill from the blackened sky. He felt his eyes grow heavy as he let the sound lull him to sleep. He dreamt of that final night in Paris, the night he caught sight of the vision in the sky. And what a vision it was, for it reminded him of someone. The demon who originally molded his mortal frame into the guise of this mythical personage. He felt himself reaching with his thoughts at last, reaching for that man who made him. He desired answers. Now he desired direction. He awoke from his nap, noticing the unlikely presence hovering mere meters from the balcony, defying gravity. Robert gasped as he collected his wits. Were his eyes betraying him? Or was this man levitating 156 feet above ground level? The figure had his arms folded in a casual manner, his long trench coat whipped about his feet as he floated there amidst the night air and the cold rain. He didn't seem to mind. Why should he? He was the demon Kronos, after all. So, Robert, how's tricks? How have things been going for you? I heard you started a revolution. Ha! Robert sat up, startled. You! Yes, it is I, Kronos, your maker. You miss me? I learned not to want you. You wound me, sir, the demon said, clutching his breast. He approached the balcony, alighted with a slow, graceful step, and took a few more steps towards the prostrate form of the Muse. Where would you be today if it weren't for my benevolence? Stuck at home, no doubt, existing from day to day, dreaming of what could have been. Look at you now. Look at what you've accomplished. You have started a revolution, my boy. You swung those doors wide for all Muse kind, and allowed all the phantom myths in the world a chance to bask in freedom at last. No more anonymity for them, eh? And no more anonymity for you. He applauded. Thanks to your temperament, your strength, and your foresight, you have cast light on all these lives. Once they, like you, sat in shadow and obscurity. No longer. Because of you, the humans saw the light at last. It's like industry changed in the blink of an eye. Human politics became more, well, humane. And that was only the starters. You've been quite busy, making changes here, affecting tweaks and alterations there. Admittedly, wealthy CEOs, not to mention the gaming industry isn't what it used to be. And all those fabulous media tycoons are beginning to feel a bit of the pinch since all this started. But que sera, eh? I say, what will be, will be. And to hell with the blithering authorities. I tell you, this is the destiny I had planned for you all along. And you did not disappoint. This is why you violated me? My mortality? So I could give you the quiet, invisible, a stab at fame? Robert asked petulantly. The other offered a broad smile. Why no. I just wanted you to achieve something truly remarkable. He came up to Robert, crouching before him. You see, I took one human being, you, a slight pinch of impressionability, a hint of adventure, as well as a sprinkle of pathos and Bang! Well, here we are. A muse with a single vision. And then he whispered, changed the world. You're crazy, Robert told him. The other stood and gazed down at the muse at his feet. Oh no, Robert, he said. After all, you went and changed the world. Change worlds, like Henry Miller once said. There's the difference. With that, the handsome demon stepped up onto the balcony's metal guard, gave him one final gesture of goodbye, and allowed himself to fall gracefully and coolly into the lights below. With his face wet from crying, Robert shifted his weight to peer over the metal railing. His demon was gone again, wasn't he? Kronos had disappeared. And why by all that was unholy did he need to come around calling anyway? He had a way of seeding doubt, that angel of cynicism. He had a way of making Robert question everything, didn't he? Maybe. Ira had been right to react the way he had done. Perhaps all this was evil and only served to prop vanity before its crooked reflection in the mirror. He cried alone. The tears mingled with the falling rain to cover his eyes with a deep and hopeless sadness. I'm always wrong. He rasped out these words finally. No matter what I do, no matter what I say, no matter what I am, I'm always wrong. He shouted up at the blackened heavens. Robert wandered inside, picking up his phone. For once he was going to put other people's feelings before his own. Felix Westwood, CEO of Fashions Co., was at his calmest when working on a new design. Usually he hated to be disturbed. This time, however, the distraction was welcome. A young woman popped her head round the door to Fee's studio. Mr. Westwood, he's here. Then, dear, show him in! The rather tall, elegant man replied with a decidedly camp bearing. Let's see him, where's my beautiful muse? Ah, Robert, how we've missed you. Mr. Westwood, the muse acknowledged reservedly as the secretary ushered him in. Oh my, aren't you a sight for sore eyes? You haven't changed a bit, Felix commented, resting the tips of his fingers against his clenched teeth in an altogether lecherous fashion. Why have I been called back? The muse asked him. Felix fluttered his long, gorgeous eyelashes. Direct and to the point. Well, that's what I've always loved about you. To answer your question, babe, you never leave the catwalk. Nobody does. It's in your blood. But then, of course, you don't have blood, do you? That stuff that's running through your veins right now like ice. What did the ancient Greeks call it? Ichor? The life fluid of the mighty gods and goddesses of Olympus? You see, that's what I needed to talk to you about, babes. That little stunt you pulled 6 years ago? The media, the news rags and platforms, etc., they don't like it when you screw things up for them. And you screwed them big. Fee's smirk was as wide as the Cheshire Cat's at that moment. It's like you drew a big old bullseye on their asses, kicked them in the hard capital, so to speak. This, as we're witnessing today, is about as far left as these kids are willing to go. You stepped on some pretty powerful feet, Robert, and that's a big no-no. Because, you see, they pay my salary. They say what goes. Who do you think owns all this stuff, huh? That's right, the media. And they answer to the tycoons, and they in turn answer to the vast companies who own software, technology, who answer to a higher power. You see my dilemma? Robert stayed silent. What I want you to do, Felix said, as he stood before the muse, straightening the buttons on his shirt, is get up on that catwalk one more time and tell the world this was just some elaborate hoax. Could you do that tiny thing for me? Fee sensed Robert's lips tighten for a moment. God knows I don't ask for much. Just a distraction, babe. The great political web, the infrastructure demands it. And they think that what the world needs right now is a positive, down-to-earth distraction, my dear. And that's what you are going to offer them. Robert thought about it. In the end, he considered it would go a long way to patching things up with an old friend. The Muse looked Fee Westwood in the eye and answered, "Okay, I'll do it." "Excellent! I'll let Wardrobe know you're coming!" Robert slept fitfully. A voice continued to unsettle his dreams as he tossed and turned. Was this voice his conscience? Or could it have been the literal ghosts from his past? It was neither. Something or someone made its presence felt amidst Robert's possessions. The phantom image of a girl stood at the foot of his bed. He sat up quickly. His eyes endeavored to focus on the white image. She mysteriously vanished, like the undetectable transition of vapor. Robert rubbed his eyes and looked again. There was just a bare wall. Quickly he rose and went into the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of water. He had to confess, seeing ghosts was definitely a new experience. Perhaps he had been putting himself under far too much stress recently. Or maybe he was actually being plagued by spirits, who could say? He went back to bed. It was still only 2:30 in the morning. He tried to close his eyes and eventually he did drift back off to sleep again. "Robert?" He sensed someone was whispering his name. "Robert, please don't go tomorrow." He turned over under his light covers, trying to cast off the torments of his mind. "I don't want you to undo all the good you have done. Please, Robert. You are loved. You are loved." He felt a gentle touch on his bare skin as he woke again with a start. Of course, there was no one else there. It was fast approaching 10 a.m., time for the big announcement. The catwalk beckoned. Felix prepared his florid entry to the gathering press members and sponsors. "I present to you the incomparable Robert Delisle!" The Muse stepped out from behind the curtain and walked up to the podium with certain trepidation. "Tell them all the truth, my darling," said Fee with a flurry of extravagant gestures. "Tell the world!" Robert inched towards the microphone. Standing in the sideline, positioned close enough to see the Muse deliver his speech, was Robert's old friend, Ira. He still didn't believe Robert would actually do it, and waited with bated breath. Suddenly, Ira felt a presence creeping up from behind him. He recognized it too late. A hand moved around to cup his mouth. He tried to struggle, but whoever it was had him in a chokehold. "Don't make a sound," he heard a voice whisper in his ear. Ira stayed perfectly quiet and still. Robert, feeling uncertain at this point, managed to address the public. "I don't know how to say this," he said. 6 years ago, I pulled a prank on you all." He bit his lip. "It was all smoke and mirrors, I admit. I had no idea that a hoax could lead to so much change in our society." Robert caught Fee's gaze as he stumbled with the words. Then he caught another person's gaze. Someone who had been sitting with the other spectators. An Egyptian girl. He paused, remembering the dream he experienced the night before. It was her! The face in last night's dream, how was that even possible? He caught her words, processing them in his head as though by telepathy. "Fear not, Robert," she was telling him. "My name is Ramla. I am from the Mythkey Institute. I am here to tell you you are not alone. You are loved. Please, don't do this. Please don't." It was the look that Felix was giving him that snapped Robert's attentions back to his present duty. "Robert, tell them now! Read the lines, urged Felix, in a hushed, clipped tone from the edge of the stage. He cleared his throat and smiled back to the sponsors diplomatically to hide his impatience. He leant over the microphone to give his final answer. "I am not an angel," he stated. "I am not what you think." He heard her voice in his head one final time, telling him not to go ahead with this folly. He paused, deliberating on the next measured words to issue from his lips. "I am a Muse," he said. and Felix turned his head, casting him a surprised look. "This is what I am," he went on to explain to the gathering, "and I'm not going to lie to anybody. I won't cover up the fact that we've been lied to all these years. I'm just not going to do it." The black feathered wings came out one more time, emerging from his spine, the span that almost filled the entire length of the platform. A gasp issued from the crowd as a spate of bursts and flashes emerged from trained cameras. At that point, Felix Westwood backed out of the room, slicking away like some coward. He recognized there were people of influence whose future was riding on this one speech. While it was evident by this point that Robert was incapable of following the set plan, Fee knew that his failure to manipulate the results meant there would be consequences. Heads were going to roll for this, and no mistake. Beyond the curtain, the shadowy entity who had Ira in a chokehold suddenly whirled around. Ira noticed the blonde hair and the strong chiseled jawline of his attacker, but Ira wasn't the one this man had come for, evidently. Felix! It was Felix Westwood this blonde assassin wanted. He was the one he was really after. He released his grip on Ira, revealing two large metallic wings from his back. They were like knife edges that sliced swaths through the air. Was this entity another Muse? Was he of the same persuasion as himself, or Robert? The blonde man with the metal wings gave chase. Feeling the anger rise from his gut, Ira hurled himself at the object of his rage, Robert. There was a struggle as the two Muses fought. Ira pushed Robert to the ground. "You selfish piece of filth!" he admonished. As he brought his foot down upon the target of his rage, the Muse deflected the first blow with his hands. Felix, in the meantime, had slunk out of the building. He understood very well there were people with influence watching him, and that the building's surveillance equipment, including cameras positioned along the street outside, would be tracking his every move. He got as far as the curb, hardly noticing the car without a license plate as it reached maximum speed. The shady figure with the metal wings did see it, however. He watched as the vehicle skidded and roared away from the victim. Walking up to the curb, the tall winged man stared down at Felix as he lay bloodied on the roadside. "Good riddance," he said, his metallic wings folding and receding into his back. His facial expression never altered even when the body, laying there on the asphalt, began to revert to a different form entirely. There was a momentary hum in the air, a purring murmur that eventually trailed off into a susurrating crackle in the air. It was the sound of frequencies changing, of pure energy faltering, reverting. The perceptual filter that had kept Felix from letting others from seeing his true appearance was disabled. The mask was finally off. What remained crumbled and turned to ash before the man's eyes. No evidence, no trace. Inside the building, Robert deflected another blow. Ira was still standing over him, his foot raised to land another attack. Ira loosened his own wings from his back. Two large butterfly wings. "Say goodbye to your troubles," he snarled. It was then he experienced a sudden pain that had targeted his skull. Ira clasped his head. He looked like he was in agony. Robert brought his foot back to land a drop kick that brought the distracted Muse tumbling backwards. The Egyptian girl held out her hand, and Robert took it, allowing himself to be helped up. He could hear her words again in his thoughts. "Quickly, you must come with me." In his apartment, Robert was laid down on the daybed. The figure with the metal wings stood watch over them. He was a Muse, just like Robert. He was a tall, fetching young man with long, curvy blonde hair and chiseled features. He told Robert that his name was Don Furman, and that he was blood squire to the fabled Mythkey Institute. The girl with whom he was already acquainted rested her hand on Robert's forehead, bidding him to rest. They both stood over Robert, he in all his handsome livery, and she in her astral form. His great metallic wings receded back into his flesh and disappeared from sight altogether. Robert was hurt, but still alive from Ira's rather brutal attack. He opened his eyes and saw his savior standing before him. It was the girl from the show.
She knelt before him, a ghost, barely visible. But she was there. In his mind's eye, she knelt before him and placed a hand gently on Robert's brow. "Robert," she told him at last, "you must come to the institution. You fly to Italy and you find us there." "What?" asked the Muse, feeling wearied and in pain. I can't, Shh. Hush, Robert. I'm recalling Don Furman. He'll be flying back to the institution. You rest now. I will remain in spirit to take care of you. Rest until you are strong enough to make the journey here yourself." Robert laid back on his couch and listened to the soothing words of the sweet ghost in his mind. In the silent recesses of the city, curious eyes watched the monitoring feed. A single spotlight was cast in the direction of a solitary figure sitting at a table. The rest of the room's illumination was dimmed with only a faint twitch of light that seemed to blink at intermittent moments. These eyes narrowed with venom and much vehemence for the object on the screen. As they scanned the recent news reports and footage, they blinked and opened again to reveal two large obsidian orbs that lacked emotion. Cold as glass, they stared at the screen and the object of concern, blinked again, and the eyes looked normal within their human orbits. A perception filter was put in place and had glitched for a moment as the user lost concentration. "The Mythkey Institute has meddled for the last time," the shadowy figure grumbled to himself. Another figure stepped out of the shadows, behind the one that was seated. "Indeed," the other said. Clearly he was the person in charge. "No matter," he added. "This is all part of the design." The one that was sitting behind the monitor looked back at the screen and blinked again. "But Robert still remains a random component," the one standing explained, "who may appear on the surface to be part of the problem. But is he? He is a diversion, like I said, but one that may yet prove useful, as he is the absolute focus of perception, hence a valued component of the game." He took a step forward, resting his hands on his subordinate's shoulders. His perception filter too flickered and waned, though only for a brief moment. In that short time, it was obvious that this was some sort of foreign form. It shifted its appearance back to offer a fully human shape again. "Another glitch in the perceptual filter?" asked the one that was seated. "It is not a problem," the other answered, moving his hand up to adjust a tiny implant in his neck. "I suggest we wait. Bide our time. This would be the most logical course of action." "I don't know," the other cautioned. "He is too dangerous. We should strike now, disappear him, make him vanish. We have the means and the tools at our disposal. We could. We will do nothing except wait. All we have to do is continue the influence of the media, educate and inform and indoctrinate. And the humans, they are nothing more than coded substance. They have no clue what they truly are or what they represent. The humans are scattered, fragmented, and diffuse. Alone they cannot fight us. Singly they cannot succeed. Divide and conquer. Has this plan ever failed us before?" The man sitting at the computer terminal remained steadfast, viewing the screen as further newsreels emerged. His eyes narrowed further. The other retired from the room, confident in the knowing that his subordinate would do precisely as told. 12 minutes passed, slowly, as the figure in the chair began to lose patience and focus, allowing more lapses of concentration. The filter waned and shimmered in the light, revealing his true appearance. The subordinate rose from his seat finally and marched towards the door. Stepping out into a corridor, he ventured down a long shaded passage before eventually reaching an elongated room, an isolation ward in effect. This ward was where several individual cells were visibly adjoined. Each cell was reinforced with thick glass. It was thick enough to keep the specimens in, though translucent enough to allow their masters a clear view of the objects inside.
Another figure stood before one of the cells as he entered. "Prisoner 1578, the gentleman responded without turning. The other continued regarding the man in front of him. He just stood before the cell's reinforcements, gloating, his hands locked behind his back. "Dr. Quagmire," the other announced, as he stepped up behind the gentleman. "Perfection!" uttered the good doctor as he regarded the entity sitting silently inside the cell. "Such perfection! The Muses were meant to add value to these human lives. Instead, for centuries they have remained largely out of the way, like a frequency that can barely be recognized or heard. And there they have remained, in obscure darkness. Until now." The other stepped up to the glass, aware of the figure seated there in the shadows. The individual was a young, male Muse. "Ira," he said, resting his hand on the glass that divided them. The Muse, who was a prisoner, looked up at the two men standing outside. "I want to introduce you to Dr. Jason Quagmire. You will be working closely with him from now on." The figure sitting within the cell barely stirred. "It's time, and you need to take your revenge. Make them regret." The Muse, Ira, remained seated, releasing his pennons in a sudden flurry of movement. He made his wings appear visible at last. They sprang from his back like petals from a flower after the rain. He had the most beautiful wings, too, the color and patterns of a red admiral butterfly. This indeed was his final answer. The man smiled as he revealed the key, easing it into the lock. He would secure his freedom, but only on a condition: that he take his revenge on the one they had targeted.